Hello, everyone. My name is Will, and this is Will's Thrills, the podcast that brings horror and animation to your headsets. And welcome to the official episode 0 of What Are We Watching? So, for those of you who don't know, and that's all of you, this is basically a podcast that'll showcase some different horror and animation media throughout our time. And basically, I'll tell you what I think about them, or anything that I've discovered, or anything interesting that I might have seen. So because this is the first official episode, I just thought I'd kind of give some background on me and why I love horror so much. So I'll start off with this. I've been watching horror movies since I've been about 8 years old. I know, young. But it's actually a really funny story how I got into it. So when I was 8, me and my cousin at the time, my cousin's about 5 years older than me. Her name is Charlisa. Charlisa, if you're listening to this, hey, what's up? Basically, when I was 8 years old, she was on the computer watching YouTube, and she called me in the room. She was like, "Oh, well, come here." And so me being 8 at the time, I adored her. Don't ask me why, I don't know. But as a kid, I was obsessed with her. I wanted her to be her friend. I wanted to go everywhere she went, everything she did. So when she would come over, I get super excited because I didn't really see her that often. So like I was saying, she called me in the room. And so I walked in there and I was like, what? She was like, I have something to show you. And I was like, what is it? And she was like, it's a movie. So immediately oh, okay, cool. So I'm watching and I'm noticing. So for those of you who don't know, it's a clip from the movie Dead or Alive. If you don't know what that movie is, it's basically a movie where there's a video game and how if you die in the video game, you die in real life. Now, for those of you who've seen that movie, you know that movie's not very good. But 8-year-old me was traumatized. So what she showed me was the very beginning of the movie. So if you've ever seen that movie, you know that in the beginning, there's a scene where it shows the little passes that you have to read. And if you've seen that movie, you know that passage is the spell that makes it so that if you die in the game, you die in the real life. Whatever. It shows the little passage that you're supposed to read and then the house. And me being dumb, I start reading it. And she says, no, don't read it. So immediately I was like, why? She was like, listen, just don't. Now, no, she's trying to trick me because she's clearly trying to keep this secret from me so that I don't be scared. So I'm watching the video and basically it's kind of a POV shot of this guy going through his house and it's dark. And it's scary, and this monster jumps out and scares him, and he falls off the balcony and gets hung. It's this whole thing. Basically, 8-year-old me gets terrified and runs out the room because I was 8. So of course I would. I run out literally crying. But for some reason, after that day, I got a weird fascination with scary videos. I can't tell you why. I can't tell you exactly for what reason. But for whatever reason, after that day, I got a fascination with horror movies and anything scary, really. It wasn't really horror movies at first because I was still scared, but I kind of got obsessed with any scary video. So after that, for anyone who's born in the 2000s, there was this really early video on YouTube that was super popular at the time. And I think it's called Ghost on the Side of a Car. In fact, I know for a fact it's still on YouTube. So type in Ghost on the Side of a Car on YouTube and you'll see it. And it's basically a car driving down a road. And it looks really normal, right? In fact, it's supposed to kind of entice you to get closer so you can be where is the ghost? And then it jump scares you. And when I found that video, I got so scared I hid under the table in the computer room at my grandmother's house. And I was terrified. I was so scared. And to the point where I was scared to look up because I thought that the ghost head was going to be peering down at me, trying to find me. I don't know. But I've also always had a super active imagination. And because of that, horror also kind of really struck me because my imagination was so strong, it would kind of seep into my reality. So by that I mean, if I watched a horror movie or something, I was the type where if I watched a horror movie, at least when I was younger, I would have nightmares. And you would think that would deter me, right? But it didn't. I don't know why. But I've always, like I said, ever since I was 8 years old, have just loved being scared. I don't know why. It's weird, I know, but it's always kind of given me like a sense of like adrenaline, which is normal. People usually watch horror movies for like the adrenaline rush of it, but I've been addicted to it, and ever since then, I've watched like all the scary movies. Honestly, unfortunately, the downside to being so like invested in horror now is that I can't go back to like the moments where I was like, oh my God, this is so scary. Like, it's kind of hard for me to see a horror movie and be scared now. And it was kind of sad, in a sense that it's kind of hard for me to get that sense of adrenaline that kind of brought me into horror movies in the beginning. But I mean, I still love them. I still love what they do. I still love the ability that they have, because I really have a lot of what's the word? I have a lot of admiration for horror directors and producers and things like that, and writers, because to be able to create a sense of fear and dread through like a sense of media, like to create a sense of fear and dread that's essentially completely constructed, is incredible. Really, it's just so crazy to like experience one, but to think about that someone could write on a piece of paper and basically convey an emotion so much that it causes a physical reaction. And I think that's really admirable, like to be able to create that. And like, for example, I write poetry, so I want to be able to create an emotion, not necessarily fear, because that's a little intense. But when I write poetry, I want people to feel the emotion that I'm trying to convey. I want people to feel what I'm writing. And I feel like horror does that. And I think horror is unique in that it creates a sense of fear, which is something that fear is very complex. It's not as like, I feel like anger tends and sadness are a bit easier to explain and understand, while fear tends to be complex because fear can be irrational. I feel like emotions like anger and sadness and happiness can be rational, and you can rationalize it, and it's very rare where someone is like sad for like no reason, or like angry for no reason, or happy for no reason. And just like that, you can also not really be scared for any reason, but the reason can be irrational. Like the fact that people can be afraid of something that's not inherently dangerous is kind of crazy, because fear in its basics is basically like a fight or flight response. And it's supposed to be like a survival tactic. Fear is built into the human body for survival. Because if you're scared of something, that means you think you're in danger. But what's crazy about that is that the way our brains are set up, there are certain things in this world that aren't dangerous, but we're still afraid of. For example, there's a bunch of people who are afraid of clowns. Clowns are not inherently dangerous. Now, however, there have been some like serial killers and stuff in history that use a clown motif for that. So I get that in that sense. But there are some people who just find clowns scary. And, you know, of course, a lot of people's fears are linked to trauma sometimes. So maybe something happened regarding clowns that made them scared. But whatever the case may be, there are people who have irrational fears. There are a bunch of phobias that are, in its basics, kind of irrational. Not to the point where they're not understandable. But some of them are irrational. Like there is, people have like a fear of like tennis balls. Or like, for example, trypophobia. The fear of like clusters of like holes is irrational because it doesn't hurt you. It can't hurt you. Even it in its essence isn't anything dangerous. But even for me, I have the slightest bit of trypophobia. Like if I see clusters of holes and stuff like that, it makes me itch. It makes my skin crawl. Like it makes me physically uncomfortable. And I couldn't really give you a good reason why. And that's what I like about a lot of horror movies, is that they can create a sense of fear without imminent danger. And I think that's impressive. To be able to create a aura of kind of like isolated emotion, there we go, is, in my opinion, really commendable, because it's not something we always see. And it's kind of unfortunate, because I was saying that it's a shame that a lot of movies don't really do that anymore. A lot of horror movies have a hard time kind of creating that sense of fear now, because what's seen as scary kind of changes throughout generation. And what I mean by that is, like, horror has ascended past whatever it initially was. Horror initially used to be very human, if that makes sense. If you've ever seen like really, really, really old horror movies, like stuff from like even the 30s or the 40s or the 50s, like, it was very human. And almost like, it's so crazy how, like, if you've ever seen like an old horror movie compared to like a horror movie that's out now, it's almost two different genres. It's kind of crazy. But yeah, just watching that kind of transformation, because me, you know, I was born 2000. I'm only 21. But I've seen those older movies and I've seen the newer ones, and watching the evolution and seeing how it's changed, like, I find that horror now is kind of lackluster, and you kind of have to really look for like those really good, juicy horror movies. Like, for example, a horror movie that I think was really good that came out fairly recently was Hereditary or Midsummer. Things like that. They are horror movies. No, these were like bigger horror movies. So I think these are kind of the exception to the whole horror being kind of lackluster thing. But it's just crazy to me how different Hereditary and Midsummer are, and how Midsummer and Hereditary being created, shout out to Ari Aster, is now creating like a new wave of horror in which they try harder on the story. Because I feel like a lot of times where horror movies kind of fall flat is the story. I feel like sometimes they focus so much on the scares that they forget about the story and the atmosphere. That's another really important thing in horror, in my opinion, is the atmosphere. To be able to create a sense of uncomfortability within me based solely on the setting. Once again, extremely commendable. But that, in my opinion, is what makes a good horror movie. Is a good, compelling story and horrifying atmosphere. Like, for me, I want a horror movie's atmosphere to be so like uncomfortable that it makes me want to get up. And I haven't had an experience like that in a long time. Like, there's been very few horror movies that I've seen that have made me want to be like, I gotta go. I can't sit through this. It's been very rare. But, you know, in those rare occasions, it's kind of mind-blowing. And I've noticed that when you get those movies like that, it changes horror forever. Horror is never the same when you find a horror movie that kind of changes how you do horror. And it happens like every once in a while. Like, for example, though Paranormal Activity was not the first found footage horror movie in any way, shape, or form, it was not the first. I would go out on a limb and kind of say that Paranormal Activity is what started kind of the found footage movement of horror movies officially. Because before that, there was the Blair Witch Project, which, by the way, is another good horror movie. If you want to watch that, watch that. In fact, I might do a video on that in the future, but whatever. Paranormal Activity created almost like, not created a new form of horror, but pretty much like I'm going to use that because that's kind of broad. Kind of created a new form of horror within itself and started found footage horror movies. Just like how Unfriended started the whole we're gonna make a horror movie on Skype thing. Though it didn't last anywhere near as long. Because, and here's the thing, it's kind of a dope, I know I'm kind of all over the place, but this is how passionate I am about horror, because I can kind of jump all over it. And that's kind of the thing with, like, I hate to say gimmick, but gimmicky horror movies are cool in the moment, but when they're not done right, and I think a lot of horror movie, like, creators think that, oh, this was really popular, so we should create something like this. But people don't realize that it's not just what was done, it was how it was done. Like, for example, the first Paranormal Activity, I will always say, no matter what nobody says about Paranormal Activity, the atmosphere that they are able to create in that movie is amazing. It is spectacular. They were able to create a movie that people genuinely think is terrifying, and yet nothing happens in that movie till the last half. And if you ask a lot of people, you'll hear a lot of people say, oh my God, the first Paranormal Activity was so scary. But if you really sit and watch that movie, not much really happens. But it's because it's able to create this atmosphere of, it's really kind of like a sense of unknown, where it's like, we are just as out of the loop as the characters. We don't know what's going on. Now, of course, later down the line, it got kind of convoluted and a lot of other things happening. We're not talking about the other ones, but we're talking about the first one. It kind of created a sense of unknown, and you didn't know what was happening, and they didn't know what was happening, and it made you nervous about what you could see, but it also made you nervous about what you couldn't see. And that's what was scary. And, you know, someday if I ever wrote a horror movie, which I'm not saying I will, although the way I feel about horror, I don't know. Keep your eyes peeled. Who knows? If I ever wrote a horror movie or like a horror book, I kind of am more kind of into horror books, because I feel like those are a whole nother realm. If I ever were to write some sort of horror media, let's say that, I would want it to genuinely create a sense of like dread. That's what I would want. I would want it to be to the point where you're like, what did I just read? But like in a good way. Yeah. So that's pretty much how I feel about horror. I know that was kind of long for like a episode 0, but I just feel like that just like gives a good basis of how I feel about horror and how it's like truly affected me. Like, I love it. I love everything about it. I've been watching it for years. And this podcast is me basically showing my appreciation to some of the horror movies I love and some horror movies I haven't seen. I'm also going to be talking about animation as well. So if you're into that, stay tuned. I'll basically, at this point, will be giving like a brief synopsis of what my official episodes will be. This is kind of like a less structured version, because of course this is episode 0. But normally what'll happen in my podcast is I'll give you guys the name of the movie or what we're watching. I'll probably tell you who it's by, give you a couple facts about the movie. And then I'm going to go scene by scene through the movie. Actually, I'm going to give a spoiler-free synopsis first. Those are probably going to be really short. And then I'm going to go scene by scene through the movie and give you kind of some little tidbits that I may have noticed. And then after I finish telling you guys what happened in the movie, I'm going to wrap it up, tell you what I thought, and then I'll give it a rating. And the way you'll know whether I'm doing a horror movie or a animation will be basically I'll say on this spectacular Sunday, or on this spooky Sunday. And of course, spooky means horror, spectacular means animation. But that's the end for today. Please like and subscribe if you guys liked what I had to say, and leave a comment down below on how you guys got into horror. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.